tort law, which is the law that potentially, at least, affects more citizens than any other law. And as a result, we think public education about its importance, the way it works, the way it benefits everybody is vital. So we're creating this new program, hopefully that can be adopted by other communities around the country in years to come as a way to promote a better understanding of what the law is, how it works, and how it benefits everybody.
What do you think is one of the most common misperceptions that is related to tort law? What do you think a common misperception is?
That's easy. It's everyone has uncritically accepted the idea that we are awash in frivolous lawsuits. That is not the case. It does not hold up to close analysis. We have an adversarial system, which means that every time a case goes to trial, one side wins and one side loses. But that doesn't mean that those cases are frivolous. Lawyers in tort cases are paid only out of the money they collect from the other side or from the insurance company. So there is no incentive for lawyers to take frivolous cases. And judges have the power to throw out frivolous cases. There just simply aren't that many. And yet, people think that we are drowning in frivolous cases. That is false. In fact, tort law has three benefits that benefit everybody. The first benefit is compensation to the injured victim, so that the wrongdoer ends up paying for the harm that he or she or it has caused, rather than us, the taxpayer, or the insurance companies. Why not make the wrongdoer pay for the harm that it caused? The second benefit is disclosure. Sometimes bad stuff goes on behind closed door. It's hidden away in the darkness, and a trial shines a light on it. Things that have been hidden for years come out in open court, subject to the rules of law, subject to the rules of evidence, subject to cross-examination, but stuff that's hidden has a bright light shined on it, and the whole world can see what's been going on. And the third benefit of tort law is deterrence. A jury verdict, or sometimes even a settlement, can result in changing conduct, so that one person who has been injured can prevent injuries to many, many other people. Compensation, disclosure, and deterrence are three great benefits of tort law that people very often overlook.
What do you think society or representations of society would be like without our understanding of tort law today? Because there's been a long history, as we learn in the museum, starting back
almost 1,000 years.
1,000 years to the present day, and our American system of tort law might be different from some other.
Yeah. Imagine a world without the courts and without tort law. It's easy. Just think back to feuds and battle axes and broadswords, because that was how disputes were resolved 1,000 years ago in England before the emergence of the jury trial and tort law. People had feuds. Clans would go to war with one another. Broadswords, battle axes, violence. That evolved into the brilliant British invention of the modern jury trial. Not like the ancient Greeks, because they had their own form of jury trial. But the English came up with this brilliant concept, the jury trial, which was regular people in every town or hamlet or village sitting in judgment of their peers, deciding right and wrong, true and false, who did it, who was responsible. This was law growing from the common people and their values, rather than law being imposed by the top down from the king or the nobles or the parliaments. It reflected community values, and it still does, which is why juries are so vitally important. It's called the common law because it reflects the values of all of us, the common people.
For the listeners at home or those driving the cars, we have already been affected by tort law because, as you mentioned before, some cases that might relate to one person then changes behavior that then we as the rest of society can benefit. Can you name a couple of common examples?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. One of them, of course, is the Ford Pinto case, Grimshaw versus Ford Motors. The Ford Pinto had a bad design, which was that the gas tank was perched behind the rear axle and in front of the license plate. And when it was rear-ended as part of the design process in crash testing, every time it was hit at 25 miles an hour or more, the gas tank would rupture, blow up. And rear-end collisions are foreseeable. So the Ford engineers knew there was a problem. They developed a fix for it that would have cost between $2 and $8. But the Ford accountants got involved and said, no, it would be cheaper to pay people who get burned or who burn to death than it would be to make these cars safer. That case went to trial. The memo that the accountants had written was disclosed in open court, and the jury verdict was so substantial, even though a judge later reduced it, that it was a real deterrent. It led to a recall, it led to a redesign, it strengthened the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. As a result of that verdict, cars are safer because of the courage of the plaintiffs and the wisdom of the jury to do justice. That's one good example. Another one is the tobacco litigation. Case after case have been brought against the tobacco companies and lost until Rose Cipollone, who was dying of lung cancer, sued the tobacco companies and won. Proved that their product was causing lung cancer. That led to the Master Settlement Agreement, which is when 46 of the states in this nation sued the tobacco companies. The tobacco companies settled. They didn't even go to trial. They paid and are paying and have agreed to pay something on the order of $250 billion to the various states for public health benefits. Because who pays for people dying of lung cancer if they don't have great insurance? We, the taxpayers. So as a result of the Cipollone case that led to the Master Settlement Agreement, smoking in this country has gone down. Mm-hmm. Ads aimed at kids are no longer around. There's no more Joe Camel. And the tobacco companies have paid a lot of money to the states to use for public health benefits. That's a good example. There are other cases like this, one after the other, where a jury verdict leads to big, sweeping benefits to everybody.
That's fantastic.
And very often, people don't even know what tort law is. Tort law is one of the three pillars of American law. The other two are contract law and criminal law. And there are, of course, a host of other types of law, but those are the three main ones. Tort law is the one that affects most people most of the time. You buy a house once or twice in your life. You buy a car every couple years. But you're exposed to torts every time you drive, every time you're admitted to the hospital, every time you use a lawn chemical or some paint product. Anything like that exposes you to injuries from unsafe conduct or bad products. Tort law is an important part of the law. And yet, as we were saying before the break, people have bought into this myth that we're awash in frivolous lawsuits as though it's not important, as though it's not worthwhile. But it is. It's important. It's worth learning about your rights so that if you or your kids or your spouse or your friends are wrongfully injured, they'll know what to do.
There's a common phrase that one might often hear either in the news or on news type programs, even if they're entertainment programs, the phrase of tort reform. Now, the founder of the American Museum of Tort Law, Ralph Nader, defines that as tort deform. Tell me what you think of when you hear the term tort reform, and how do you think people should react to that?
Tort reform has been a concerted effort to limit people's access to justice. It has been first a psychological attack, which is where this notion of frivolous lawsuits come from. When I give tours to groups of visitors at the museum, I always ask if people have ever heard the phrase frivolous lawsuit, and every hand goes up. Mm-hmm. And then I ask them, name one. No one can name one. and yet everyone accepts that idea. So there was a psychological attack. There have been efforts to raise the bar to keep people from going to court. We're fighting now, nationally, mandatory arbitration clauses. Anytime you click to accept terms and conditions online, for the most part, you're giving up your right to go to court and agreeing instead to be bound by arbitrators selected by the other side in a state of their choosing. That's an attack on the court system. Limits on the ability of the jury to do justice by capping damages is not only an attack on the authority of the jury, but it affects the most severely injured people unfairly. So tort reform, although it sounds benign, is actually a malicious effort funded in great measure by corporate interests and insurance companies to limit people's access to justice. It has been a long fight, and it's a fight that is not over.
So obviously learning about one's rights is one of the most essential parts of keeping those rights. Would that be a fair assessment to make?
Yeah, the old phrase was use it or lose it. And very often people just truly, and it's not their fault, the law has been treated as mysterious and arcane, opaque. It is not well taught in high school civics classes anymore. It's not taught in college. Unless people really take the time to learn about their rights, to understand the entire structure of the law, very often tort law is underutilized. There have been studies that show that something on the order of only 2% of medical malpractice ever winds up in court. 98% of it just disappears. People die every week as a result of medical malpractice without knowing. So by educating themselves, by learning what their rights are, by learning a better understanding of how the law works, in all of these areas, people can protect themselves, can protect their family, and build a more just society.
Before we get into the tort law day, I just want to clarify two things. The first is the common, how you're defining it as the misperception that the public may have about frivolous lawsuits. How would you characterize the number of lawsuits that are tort law cases today versus maybe 30, 40 years ago? Are there more cases being filed today or less?
No, there are fewer lawsuits every year and fewer jury trials every year. The courts have been active in trying to divert cases from trial into arbitration or mediation. Fewer lawsuits are filed, in part, I think, because lawyers are very careful to screen out cases. They won't take crazy or frivolous cases. But as a result, and sometimes people who are injured have bought into this sort of mentality. They don't want to make trouble. They don't want to make waves. They don't want to complain. They can't believe that someone would sell a product that was really defective or dangerous. And yet, we see it happening over and over. So, tort law is underutilized. There's a lot of scholarship in this that suggests lots and lots of injuries that are wrongful injuries never go to court, never get compensation, never get justice. People need to learn more about the law in order to better understand their rights. The studies about the head injuries that football players suffer have really been chilling. And the difficulty is the studies have been based on professional NFL players, but kids start getting head injuries in high school and in college. And most of them aren't going to ever play professional football. They won't make a living doing it. So a lot of young men, for the most part, are at risk of head injuries for a sport that has, for too long, it hasn't been recognized at how dangerous it can be. But that's just one aspect. You know, there have been a couple cases recently where people in the stands have been really hurt or killed in some cases by foul balls being hit in a baseball park because the netting that protects them doesn't extend out far enough. So someone sitting down the third base line has a fraction of a second to get out of the way when a foul ball or a broken bat comes lashing through. These are the kinds of torts that can happen, whether you're a spectator or a participant. It's just an example that shows how broadly this reach can be. When something is foreseeable that can cause harm and is not rectified, that can lead to wrongful injuries. So our objective is to educate people about what this law is, how it works, and how it benefits them.